Welcome. Did you want to wait another minute? I think we have a good crowd to get started because I know that we'll have a ton of questions. So I'll pass it on to you, Kate, and whenever you're ready, you can get us started.
Thanks, Taniqua. So welcome to the History of Housing Segregation in West Hartford. I'm Kate Gervais, one of the two volunteer ambassadors. And we wanted to share this opportunity to learn more about this topic. It is very important, and we wanted to let you know more about this important topic and to learn from Taniqua Hughley and Jack Doherty. My other town ambassador is Jen Ramirez, who you'll hear from at the end of the discussion. We want to be able to create the kind of town that we want to live in. And so there are going to be a series of programs for our neighbors to learn how to be intentional about the tools that exist to create this kind of town. And once we understand better how this town became the way it is and what we need to be able to do to create a welcoming town or make it a more welcoming town, then we can do a really great job in being able to build on what we have here. And so I'm excited, and I hope you all are excited to learn more about the history of our town and the things that sometimes we have thought were accidental, but actually might not be so accidental. So without further ado, join Jen and I, Taniqua and Jack, and all of us in learning more about the history of segregation in West Hartford.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Kate. And so as some of you may know, my name is Taniqua Hughley. I am the Outreach Director for Open Communities Alliance, and I have the great pleasure of being joined by Professor Jack Doherty, a professor at Trinity College. And so he'll share some of his amazing research with you all, and I will do the same. So let me get started, and I will share my screen. Let's see. Okay, so I'm working off of multiple screens. So if I look to the side, I promise I still see you. And Aaron, I will give you the chance to take control of our chat simply because I can't see it, but thank you. So again, welcome to the History of Housing Segregation in West Hartford. I am the Outreach Director of Open Communities Alliance, so I've had the great opportunity to work with Jen and Kate to really think about the various ways that we can educate the town of West Hartford on housing within West Hartford and the status of affordable housing in West Hartford. And so one thing that I will note right off the bat is that West Hartford is in a unique place. West Hartford is a diverse community. However, West Hartford faces internal segregation. And so we'll talk a little bit about that later on in the conversation. I'll share some stats and data, national data, but then also for West Hartford. So Open Communities Alliance is a Connecticut-based civil rights nonprofit. We work with an urban and suburban interracial coalition to advocate for access to opportunity, particularly through promoting balanced, affordable housing development in all communities in the state. And so some people may not know this, especially when I think some folks received our email and they may have questioned, how is Connecticut one of the most segregated states in the nation? And maybe that's what brought you here today to learn about the answers to that question. So yes, Connecticut is one of the most segregated states in the nation, and this is shaped by multiple factors: zoning, the location of subsidized housing units, the disinvestment in cities of need, the history of intentional segregating policies, the limits on housing jurisdiction, and again, zoning and the subsidized housing locations are two of those leading factors. So you'll hear from Professor Jack Doherty, who will talk a little bit about the history of that, but then I'll share a little bit more about the actual numbers. So not only are we the most segregated in the nation, but we have the 10th highest housing wage in the nation. So that means a family has to work 96, someone has to work 96 hours per week to afford a 2-bedroom rental in our state. We know that there are several disproportionate factors such as employment, education, income, and housing that shape the opportunity for people. And so I think that it's important to also note the racial wealth gap. And so we have huge disparities in things such as education, crime and incarceration rates, unemployment rates, and housing affordability as well. So historically, Blacks and Latinos earn on average half or less of what whites earned and had at 10% or less of the wealth. A few years ago, OCA published this amazing Out of Bounds report, which helped us highlight some of these disproportionate factors. So this report defines opportunity while highlighting the areas of the state that are thriving and struggling. And in this report, we also analyzed the location of subsidized housing units throughout the state. So using that data, we were able to create opportunity scores. And so a lot of people talk about achievement gaps, but we should really look at the overall picture of these factors that influence a person's life. So at OCA, we look at the opportunity gap, not just the achievement gap. Education, employment, and neighborhood quality are 3 indicators that shape the levels of opportunity. And we combine these 3 opportunity scores, which allow us to come up with that final opportunity score, which you can see here. And so then using this opportunity score, we're able to create opportunity maps. So some folks, if you've seen these maps before, these are our new, improved, and updated maps. Using those indicators, OCA was able to create these opportunity maps to show how stark the differences between opportunity levels in the state of Connecticut. There are 5 different levels of opportunity, rating from very low to very high. The darker the orange color represents towns that are thriving, so towns that have low unemployment rates, towns that have excelling schools, towns that have higher home ownership rates, and the low opportunity areas are more likely to have higher poverty rates, higher crime rates, and higher unemployment rates. Just a few examples of those. Using our map of opportunity, we then put on a layer which will allow us to see where people of color are located in the state. And so using this same map, you can see here in some of our city areas, here being Hartford, the folks of color are more likely to be in our towns that are very identified as very low to low opportunity areas. So there's a direct correlation in opportunity and where people of color are living. So where do we live in the state? So 12 out of 17 of our census tracts in West Hartford are actually identified as very high opportunity areas. Today, 26% of the white population in Connecticut lives in very high opportunity areas compared to only 4% of the Black population that lives in high opportunity areas, 8% of the Hispanic population, and 27% of the Asian population in the state. This is a closer look at Hartford County. So here we have Hartford, here we have the West Hartford area. And so you can see the various levels of opportunity in our county. And so choices are limited by the location of, choices are limited for many families when it comes to finding an affordable place to live. And as you can see here in our county, Hartford and New Britain are the the cities that are considered very low. However, we have many thriving towns that surround us. So we have Glastonbury, we have West Hartford, Simsbury, Avon, and South Windsor, just to name a few. More than half of the Hispanic and Black population in the state of Connecticut live in very low and low opportunity areas. So as you can see here, 74% of the Black population lives in very low, low and moderate opportunity areas, and 32% for the Asian population and 68% for the Hispanic population, compared to the 25% of the white population, and this is within the overall state. 3% of the land area in our state is considered very low opportunity. Only 7% of the white population live in this very low opportunity area, compared to 47% of the Black population and 43% of the Hispanic population. So almost more than half of the Black and Hispanic population is living in the 3% area of the state that's considered very low. So yes, where you live matters. And I know folks are here today to find out about West Hartford, so I'm going to dive into West Hartford's data. And so I have a lot of numbers on this chart, but I'll draw out some of the bigger numbers, a summary. I'll give a summary of this. So this chart shows the percentage of people by race and ethnicity in West Hartford. According to the 2019 census data, West Hartford has a population of 63,063 people. And so 73% of that population is white, identifies as white, and 5% of that population identifies as Black, 8% of the population identify as Asian, and 11% of the West Hartford population identifies as Hispanic. So the population of Black residents in Hartford is approximately 6 times higher than the Black population. I'll highlight this here. So the population in Hartford the population of residents in Hartford is about 6 times higher than the Black population in West Hartford. And so all of these things together impact things such as such as health and education. And so in addition to our opportunity maps, we also have a health disparities map and a fair share map and a mobility app. So with our health disparities app, we are able to see the life expectancy rates across the state and asthma rates. In Hartford, a very low opportunity neighborhood, we see that the life expectancy rate for someone is 77 years old, compared to Hartford, West Hartford, where someone is 85 years old, can live up to 85 years old. And the asthma ED rate, I know I saw that we had, I think, 2 physicians in our chat here. The ED rate for asthma is also a drastic difference. Here we can see that there are 154.2% people per 10,000 population in Hartford that go to the hospital for asthma ED rates, compared to only 28.4 in the town of West Hartford. So where you live matters. Where you live not only affects your education and access to opportunity, but unfortunately your health as well. And so I also included the numbers here for Glastonbury, where the life expectancy rate for someone in Glastonbury is 80 and their asthma ED rate is 7.5. So similar to our opportunity map, the state of Connecticut pulled together multiple factors and indicators to create a next generation accountability percentage, which tells us how well a school is doing, how well a school is preparing a child for college and for life. And so that's multiple factors. That looks like, I think one of them, in addition to the test scores, This was also about the growth of a child over the years, chronic absenteeism, but several things. This was a holistic approach. And here, as you can see, the next generation accountability percentage for Hartford was 60 compared to West Hartford, which was 82%. So we're right next door to each other, a few blocks away, and there is this drastic difference in our education system. So again, this is not a surprise. And unfortunately, and I'll reiterate this once again, where you live determines, unfortunately, the quality of our children's education. And I remember earlier today, I looked up some statistics for schools. One of Hartford's high schools graduation rate was 60%, and Hall in West Hartford had a 60% graduation rate, and Hall in West Hartford had a 97% graduation rate. So that's a huge difference, and that all relates to where one lives. And so another difference that we found, and this is all from the census data, this is there, we didn't make these numbers up. We saw a big difference in the number of voucher holders in Hartford and West Hartford. So in Hartford, we have 8,474 voucher holders, but in West Hartford, we only have 837 voucher holders. And so what we can, in addition to the race layer that you saw on our opportunity map, when we use a map that shows the location of subsidized housing units in the state, those things fall hand in hand. It's the exact same pattern. So what you can see here is you'll find a concentrated number of voucher holders in Hartford and very sporadically the number of voucher holders in the town of West Hartford. So throughout the next few slides, I will continue to compare West Hartford to its neighbor, Hartford. And so just pointing out here that there is, here in West Hartford, the median income is $104,281. There's a difference of about $68,000 between West Hartford and Hartford's median income. And so there's a pattern here. When you think about median income in a town, you'll see that median income relates to the poverty rate, it'll relate to, again, education access and the unemployment rates as well. So the poverty rate, the median home value, and the percentage of single families in Hartford is much lower than it is in West Hartford or Newington. And 70% of West Hartford's homes are identified as single family homes compared to Hartford, for example, where it's 17%. Newington is a little higher than Hartford, 75% of their housing stock is for single families. So this is a direct result of concentrated poverty and disinvestment in communities. So Hartford has a total, and I'm sharing a ton of numbers, so I'm more than happy to share my slides on and post it on our website. So Hartford has a total of 10,394 subsidized housing units compared to West Hartford, which only has 643 subsidized units. Another important thing to point out in this chart is the inclusionary units, also known as the deed restricted units. You'll see here that Hartford has 0 deed restricted units, and actually, let me take a step back. Deed restricted units are really those units that are set aside for affordable units and market rate developments. And so Hartford historically has never really needed set asides for affordable units because all of the subsidized housing and affordable housing was always placed in Hartford. And so West Hartford has 250 inclusionary units, also known as the deed restricted units. And so and then I'm going to move on over here to the 830G column. So only 7.9% of West Hartford's units are considered affordable using the 830G standard. And meanwhile, in Hartford, unfortunately, we have the percent of affordable units are 39.30. So to solve, some of these issues, we can put more affordable housing in the high and very high census tracts, right? So, and I think the fair share number for West Hartford is about 1,900, which is smaller compared to some of our other suburban towns. But West Hartford's main issue is the internal segregation, which I mentioned before. And to solve that, it's really ensuring that we have affordable housing units and subsidized housing units in those very high and high opportunity census tracts. And so we can still put affordable housing in that moderate opportunity area, but it can't be like 60, 70% affordable. There has to be a good balance. And so this is all interrelated. Median income, correlates with school performance and access to opportunity, the health and access to jobs as well. And so I'll say this again, where you live matters. West Hartford is doing a relatively good job compared to some of the other towns. West Hartford's focus really has to be on the internal segregation. And so some of these things that we can do is just make sure that we continue to bring impactful and effective investments to communities in lower opportunity areas, but also in those moderate opportunity areas in West Hartford, but also just to ensure that, the families, when families are looking for housing, that they truly have a choice in where they live, right? And that they have access and the funds from the state and government using that voucher to be able to live wherever they would like. So with that said, I'm sure I have a ton of questions and comments in the chat, but I'm going to pass it over to Professor Jack, and I look forward to engaging with you all soon.
Great. Hey, Taniqua, thanks very much for that overview of where things stand today. And my job, as we discussed, was to talk about how we got to this point in time. So in the chat, I just put in a link into the slides I'm about to share. I'm an educator, and so I like to be able to share materials. And Taniqua, can you give me access to share my screen again, please? That's great. In a minute, I'll open up my slides and walk through these here on the screen. And I'm still not quite there. Yeah, Taniqua, I'm still disabled for sharing my screen. If you can make me the co-host again.
I can do that.
Thank you.
There
Great.
we go.
Fabulous. Okay, so. And Taniqua, can we see everything? Everything good?
Yes, you're all set, Professor.
That's great. Thanks very much. So my focus tonight in 15 minutes, think of this as a bit of a little history lesson, but more importantly, that conversation starter. My focus is really on housing segregation, how it shifted over time in West Hartford. And I'm thrilled to be here with all the panelists who invited me in to share what I've got to offer with you today. Everything I have as an educator, I try to make openly available, so you can see the slides on my Twitter feed, or also just look at the link right there in the chat. And remember, everything I'm going to show tonight in these 15 slides for 15 minutes will go pretty quickly, but you'll see many links and many references to draw from a couple of resources to learn about our history in West Hartford. And both of these are open access resources. The first one is the On the Line book in progress that my students and I are writing. The goal of the book is to make visible the boundary lines that are dividing metropolitan Hartford and the activists who've been crossing over, redrawing, and erasing these lines. It's an open access book in progress. As we finish chapters, we put them online at that link there. And a shout out also to my friend Tracy Wilson, also the West Hartford town historian. Check out her Life in West Hartford book. You can purchase a copy of the Noah Webster House, and it's also open access at the link there. Tracy and I and others have been delving into this history, so a lot of good material. Here's the overview of what I'd like to share tonight. How have tools of housing segregation changed over time? When we think of it as we think about housing segregation, but really there are tools that people have used to keep people in or out of different places. And when you think about those tools, you can start sort of sometimes seeing patterns about how different people have used different tools in different ways. Now, I'm going to argue tonight that if you look at West Hartford's history, I believe you see a shift over the past century that looks roughly something like the following. We see very overt racial segregation in an early period with governmental support, and I'll show examples of that. And then later on, we'll see that there's, with the Fair Housing Act in the United States, growing governmental enforcement, thanks to a lot of activists who are pushing for this, of racial desegregation in housing. But parallel to all of that has been a rise of economic segregation through exclusionary zoning practices. So I think that if we want to get a better grip of how we got to where we are today, we need to sort of see all three of these shifts happening and see the relationship with one another. And I hope the examples will clear this up. Let's go back and look at some early examples of what I call overt racial segregation with governmental support. And you can see many of these starting in the 1930s. Here is what the many people refer to as the redlining maps. And this is an example of 1937. You can see West Hartford on the left and Hartford on the right. And so back in the Great Depression, the federal government was trying its best to jumpstart the housing economy. And federal officials worked with local banks and other lenders here in Hartford area. And they went through neighborhood by neighborhood and they tried to rate what's the risk of lenders for giving a mortgage to people who live in that particular neighborhood. Now, they didn't just look at whether the existing homes there were built out of brick or other types of materials. They also looked at the composition of who lived there, because in the people's minds at the time, who lived there really was determining what they thought the risk should be. You were what we call today redlined. If you lived in a certain area, your risk level in the eyes of lenders might be raised or lowered based on who was there, especially on the racial, ethnicity, and social class composition of the neighborhood. In fact, if you looked in here in a sample of what one of the reports looks like, this is using the language of the time, the 1930s, and this is pointing to area D1. It's actually in the red area over there on the Hartford near the Connecticut River. And you can see that the way the forms are set up here, they were looking for what was the composition of the people lived there, their estimated income, their occupations. Were there foreign-born families, the federal inspectors would ask? If so, what groups? And what percentage of the people were African-American or using the language at the time, whether this was considered infiltrations, and also how many families were on relief, or today what we call as families with government assistance. So here's overt racial segregation with government support, rating neighborhoods for private lenders to help make them decisions about where they would lend. Now, that's not the only thing that was happening. I actually argue that Federal Housing Administration lending rules are actually more powerful than just the HOLC color-coded maps we see. Those maps grab our attention, but the Federal Housing Administration had a very innocuous-looking document called the Underwriting Manual, which actually, when you look at the language of it, it was much more influential than those color-coded maps. The lending rules that FHA created in the 1930s, they very clearly favored newer construction compared to older homes. And they also favored loans if you lived in an all-white area. So growing suburbs like West Hartford would qualify for many of these FHA loans. You can see the language right in the document where they talked about how the evaluators looking through the FHA applications should rate the location of a home. And they would look for whether or not there were incompatible racial and social groups present, or the probability of a location being invaded by such groups. If you lived in an area that was considered to be likely to have a racial transition, you were much less likely to get an FHA loan for decades. And you can even see here on a sample form here, just having a low rating on just your location would be enough to reject your FHA application, even if you had good indicators on all the other measurements they had in mind. Another way that racial segregation has been overtly done with governmental support, we can see these in race restrictive covenants. So my students and I look through property deeds in the town of West Hartford's records, and we looked for something that we'd seen in other locations, and when we dug around, we actually found some of these here in West Hartford. Race restrictive covenants mean that a housing developer wrote into the property deed a restriction of who could live there when they were building the homes. And because these were approved by the local governments, they could be enforced at the state court levels in the 1940s as well. Here's an example of some that we found in West Hartford. Different residential areas might have wording written in that would say, quote, "No persons of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot, except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or a tenant." So this is shocking language to a lot of people who've lived in West Hartford and never thought that we had this type of overt racism inside our own property records. It didn't cover every single property, but we were surprised, and certainly many homeowners today are surprised to find out how many people actually have this type of language in your property deed. Now, the US Supreme Court ruled that these were unenforceable back in 1948. But just in 2021, just this year, the state of Connecticut passed a law that actually allows homeowners to officially strike them from your records. So even though they're not enforceable, people can take action and actually remove them from our records. One more example close to home, and a painful one, about racial segregation with government support has been in the area of public housing. During World War II, the federal government built a lot of wartime housing for workers to come into the Hartford and the region, and to build the ammunition and the other materials to win the war. West Hartford officials were actually really sensitive about the federal government building public housing and lobbied very hard to ban Black wartime workers from getting into public housing. If we actually can see here, this is photos of what some of the public housing looked like. This was called the Oakwood Terrace. And here's a headline from a West Hartford local newspaper in 1943. It was very blatant at the time. In the language of the time, quote, "Negroes may not move into the Oakwood War housing tract." And that was the arrangement that West Hartford officials worked really hard behind the scenes to, but also in the newspaper, to block African-American workers from coming into West Hartford. The town actually demolished these homes in 1954 rather than leaving up publicly subsidized housing in many neighborhoods. You can read more about this in the book here. Today, if you look to see where this is actually just a past and present. That's the aerial image on the left in 1951 of the Oakwood tracks. And if you look today, it's right around where the apartment buildings are for the Kennedy Memorial Park, right near Prospect Avenue. Now, overt racial segregation is still with us in some ways, but gradually government enforcement has grown with a lot of activists pushing for it to reduce and diminish overt racial segregation. So we've seen things like the following. Moving up to the 1970s, we've seen examples of, here's real estate firms in West Hartford and elsewhere that were evading the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which said you couldn't have racial segregation in housing. And the way that real estate firms got around the federal law at the time was they were just very clearly steering people of different races to different neighborhoods. They would market homes in West Hartford versus Hartford or Bloomfield based on different races of clients. And activists pushed really hard to get the federal government to actually enforce the law that was on the books since 1968 and to prosecute these cases. Here's an example of something here. This is from a group called Education Instruction. It was a civil rights group in the 1970s. And they actually put out housing discrimination testers where they would send, for example, a white couple to a real estate office one week, and maybe the next week, a Puerto Rican couple or an African-American couple. And they would have the same script, the same economic profile of what they were looking for. And they would either be recording or taking detailed notes about what did the real estate agents tell them, which properties do they offer to show them. So here's actually some of the material used in a court case of, this is evidence given by two white housing discrimination testers. That was just a couple from Glastonbury. And in 1974, they were going to the office of someone named Joan Carr on Farmington Avenue in West Hartford. She was a real estate agent, and she was steering them in one direction or the other. The local civil rights activists pushed hard for the federal government to actually enforce the fair housing laws. And actually in 1974, won a settlement that and forced 7 out of the 8 largest real estate firms in the Metro Hartford region to they settled out of court, that they sort of were acknowledging there was racial bias going on. Racial steering was banned, but for many of these real estate firms, this was more or less a slap on the wrist and an agreement to sort of do training. The Hartford Courant ran a follow-up story in the 1980s and still found that nearly half of the real estate firms were still engaging in some type of real estate steering, racial steering at that time. Now, while I don't want anyone to think that racial segregation has gone away, we certainly have to acknowledge that the enforcement of civil rights laws like the Fair Housing Act of 1968 has put a dent in some forms of overt racial segregation in housing with government support. But the parallel track I want to point to here, something that we don't always look at as clearly, is look at economic segregation that began around the same period, 1920s, and has continued with government support, and particularly places like West Hartford. Let me take it back to 1923. There was a dispute not far from where I am right now in West Hartford about a building permit. Now, what made this dispute interesting was the town of West Hartford blocked a grocer named Jacob Goldberg. He was a Jewish grocer from Hartford, had a store in Hartford, and they blocked him from building a store. And the location, you can see it on the blue rectangles on this map, past and present. It's right off the Farmington Avenue near Ardmore Road. And Jacob Goldberg was furious. He actually went to court over this because he had hired an architect. He had followed all of the building codes, but West Hartford was, at least in his view, arbitrarily telling him he could not build a store there. Now, some people might say, well, is it a residential neighborhood? Was he allowed to build a store there? Notice there's a very large building next to it. That's the Connecticut Armory. So there's an enormous non-residential building next door, and he still wasn't allowed to build the store until he finally prevailed and his lawyers convinced West Hartford that he was going to make a big mess out of this. He was going to make a big dispute out of this. And they allowed him to build his store finally. It actually became Kingswood Market, which is shut down years ago, but the building still exists today, right on Farmington Avenue. Now, this is important because it's a dispute. It's a dispute about keeping some people out of building in West Hartford. West Hartford never overtly said that it was because he was Jewish, but certainly there was this during a period of intense anti-immigration fervor, and he had an architect. He had followed all the rules. What was the reasoning for why he couldn't build a store with apartments above it? West Hartford wanted control over who could build what where. And so when West Hartford lost this particular case, what they did the next year was they enacted, with the help of the state government, a new type of policy, zoning. And zoning laws were designed and enacted, and West Hartford was the first to enact them in all of Connecticut. Zoning laws were designed to give local municipalities more control over who could build what kind of buildings in different places. In fact, West Hartford adopted zoning rules that actually made it really difficult for anyone to build multifamily housing, because the rules set it up so that it made it uneconomic for people to build multifamily housing in most areas, and they strongly favored single family housing and actually moved commercial and other types of establishments to certain areas. This is a map here in 1924 of one of the very first zoning maps that West Hartford adopted. And the consultants they brought in wrote out sentences like the following. And let me read this out loud here and help you set in what this is saying. The consultants in 1924 wrote a report which West Hartford adopted, which said, while 3-family houses and apartment houses are not prohibited in the A, B, or C areas, which is a large portion of the areas you'd see on the map, their erection will, for the most part, be rendered uneconomic by the lot area, lot width, and side yard requirements, all of which increase with the number of families to be housed. In other words, West Hartford, back in the 1920s, adopted rules that made it very clear that a large portion of land was going to be set aside for larger, more expensive single-family homes because they were required to have large sections of land to build upon. Now, there was nothing in the zoning regulations then or now that actually made things a racial exclusion or an anti-Semitic exclusion against people like Jacob Goldberg. But clearly there's economic exclusion going on here, because if the rules were set up to make housing more expensive, requiring more larger lots of land on it, that's going to price out people who can't afford higher price single family homes. And so you can actually see this sort of here in a chart. I went through the regulations and sort of made a scale chart here of what the minimum land required was per family back in West Hartford with the very first zoning laws of 1924. And you can see the letter A here was saying that to have one family, housing for one family, you had to have at least 9,000 square feet of land. And that looks like on the green right there, that looks like a larger chunk. So for a typical one family home, you need that much land. And that of course raises the dollar value up. Now, West Hartford, they did allow other types of areas. You actually had some areas set aside for apartments where you needed only 700 square feet of land, and that was much more affordable. But the amount of space that West Hartford allocated for apartments was actually quite minimal. They only wanted a few places to have apartment buildings. They wanted much more of West Hartford to be single family homes, and certainly large portions of West Hartford that had not been developed at that point were slated to be zone A or B, the more expensive single family homes, rather than the duplexes or the triples that might be more affordable for families. So what happened over time? Lots of Connecticut local governments and the state government did a lot of things to increase the amount of exclusionary zoning. You see in the 1950s here, we see that although West Hartford was the first town to sort of implement and adopt exclusionary zoning rules, it sort of sets off a race between different suburbs where they're competing with one another to sort of outzone each other and to try to limit who can move there based on people who have the much higher wealth areas. Now, if you look at the map on the right here in the green, you see West Hartford in its zoning rules as they got updated in the 1950s, but then Bloomfield above it and Avon over to the left. And the darker green means that was the higher minimum land requirements. So West Hartford actually increased its top level land requirements from only 9,000 square feet per single family home, in some cases up to 11,000 or 18,000 square feet of land for a single family home. But if you look above in Bloomfield and in Avon, their restrictions were even higher. In some cases, you need to have 2 acres of land just to build a single family home. So we see this sort of like taking off in many different suburbs across the area about different towns outzoning one another and trying to attract or only allow in the most exclusive families who could afford to move there. Now, I'm going to pause here with the history lesson, and I do want people to make sure that we see more of what Taniqua and others are doing about looking at the present day impact of the exclusionary zoning. The houses that are in West Hartford, they're not built by accident. This is actually, they look this way because of plans that people made, of tools of segregation that different generations of West Hartford property owners and government officials approved, either based on overtly racial or economic segregation tools. And certainly look at what, in addition to the Open Communities Alliance, organizations like the Connecticut Fair Housing Center and the Segregate Connecticut, look at what they have as well. There's many organizations who are trying to draw attention to exclusionary zoning today. But I want to leave you with a concluding question here. If you buy the argument I'm putting out here that the tools of housing segregation, if they have changed over time from just overt racial segregation with government support, as we saw in redlining and restrictive covenants and the FHA lending rules at the time, to number 2, there's been growing government enforcement of racial desegregation. We still have racism with us, but at least we have more rules on the books, and there is enforcement of rules to sort of push down racial desegregation, push down racial segregation in housing, thanks to many activists and organizations like Open Communities Alliance who are pushing for this. But it's that third factor here, this rise of economic segregation through exclusionary zoning. That's something I think we need to pay just as much attention to. And it's often sliding under the radar because it's zoning. It's complicated. It's not overtly racial. It's not overtly anti-Semitic, but it often it is designed by people who were trying to keep out other people from places like certain neighborhoods in West Hartford. So if the tools of housing segregation have changed over time, I think the question is, how should we update our tools to fight segregation now and in the future? I'll leave it at that. Okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you for leaving it on that note. And so I see Aaron did start answering quite a few questions in the chat. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, but I will highlight, just in case some folks missed some of those questions and answers, I will highlight a few. And so one of the questions that was asked was, what is a voucher? Like, what is that? I've heard of it. I don't know what it is. And it's pretty much an opportunity for families to receive funding from the government. It can be a portion of their rent, or the full amount of their rent. This money comes from the government that will allow them to pay for their rent. So it's government funds that pretty much provide opportunities for folks to help with the cost of their housing. And then I saw another question in here about the difference in the health. I'm trying to locate it. Oh, Margaret, she asked, to what extent is the lower life expectancy rate in Hartford influenced by the murder and manslaughter rates as opposed to health and poverty influences? So, and Aaron, thank you for that response. So those do factor into the life expectancy rates. And what's important to note is that none of these things are separate. These are all interrelated. So, the murder and manslaughter rate, it directly influenced the health and poverty rate. Those are all, pretty much the same things that goes into, well, not the same things, but those are all, the murder and manslaughter rates are effects of the health and poverty influences in that city. So we can't think about them as separate things. And let's see if we have any more questions in here. Is there, one question that I see folks, someone asked was, I think there was so much in the chat, but someone asked, how does the law influence, Section 8 voucher holders and those folks who receive subsidies due to COVID? And so how does that influence their, gaining access to housing with a landlord? So to answer your question, it is illegal to discriminate against someone who is a voucher holder. So just because someone says that they have a Section 8 voucher to pay for their home, that is, and the landlord says no, that is illegal. And I see Aaron was coming off of mute, so go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, Tanique was completely right. It's in Connecticut, not like every state in the country. We're actually in the minority. We have something called source of income protection, which means that a landlord can't discriminate against a potential tenant because of their source of income, including whether they're using a voucher. The question is open still on some of the COVID resources. So there's not a complete and locked up answer to that, although I would certainly make the argument that the COVID resources should count as a source of income. And yes, source of income discrimination in Connecticut and all over the country, including places like Connecticut that have source of income protection, is rampant. I've done testing for this in my career and found that something around, at least half of the time, voucher holders are treated differently from potential renters without vouchers.
Yes, thank you. And Aaron, and so someone asked, are vouchers the same as Section 8 vouchers? So Section 8 vouchers is just one form of the housing subsidies, housing vouchers that we offer here in the state. And I saw another question. Yes, Kristen, we hear that a lot, where landlords say, I don't accept vouchers. If you are on the call and you are in the process of a housing search and a housing provider, a landlord says this to you, we will definitely tell you to refer to our friends at the Fair Housing Center. OCA also recently just started a testing program as well, which Professor Jack talked a little bit about. So it's important that we share that knowledge. And I know that we have a lot of realtors and landlords on the call as well. So it's important that we inform our colleagues about this behavior. And so I know we have a few minutes left. I will go into another question. We have a question from Phil Tegler. What role, apologies, I am in our office and the cleaning folks are here. What, I don't think they didn't expect me here. What is the role of racial imbalance in West Hartford schools? How does that affect housing segregation? So I'm going to pass that on to either Professor Jack and or Aaron.
So, I mean, obviously, depending on how school districts are organized, residential segregation dictates what school demographics look like. And I know, as I understand it, there have been iterations over time in West Hartford about redesigning some of the school districts in ways that actually lead to some greater equity. But I know there's some of the local folks may be able to speak a little better to some of the more recent developments there. Or not.
I think, Aaron, the last time, to my knowledge, there was a broad movement to try to rethink all of these school attendance boundaries in West Hartford. I think that was around 1995 or so.
Yeah.
And this is what we have today because of it was a controversial hot issue that many politicians didn't want to take on. Though community members often said, well, why are the lines drawn the way they're drawn? We should be able to rethink and reevaluate whether they're meeting our goals as a community, people who want to live together in a diverse community. To what extent are the existing rules meeting our goals?
Our board member, Bilal Sekou, thank you for joining us today, Doctor. His question, and I'm gonna pass this on to Professor Jack, from professor to professor. Gene Slater's book, Freedom to Discriminate, talks about how realtors in California shaped laws to create and justify residential segregation, culminating in a constitutional amendment that prohibited fair housing. Did the real estate industry in Connecticut exercise their power by lobbying for legislation to justify their practices?
And I've got to apologize, Nico. I can't see the question and I'm not sure if I'm absorbing it all. So
Okay.
I'll do my best to look at it and respond to it after this. It sounds like somebody's trying to ask a sort of historical comparison question with California.
Yeah. And I also just put it in the chat.
Okay.
So
and actually, maybe Jack, while you're reading that, I can just highlight Greg Kirshner's response. Greg Kirshner is the legal director of the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. So thank you, Greg, for just sort of clarifying the position of the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities around those pandemic protections and counting them as sources of income for the purposes of our housing discrimination laws. So just to emphasize that, that's a great an important position by the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities.
And briefly, in response to the question, whereas real estate agents in California lobbied their state government to modify the rules that way, Connecticut didn't follow the exact same path, but certainly real estate interests in Connecticut have exercised a lot of power to make sure there hasn't been tremendous change with fair housing laws widespread in Connecticut.
Thank you. And so I see Jill Harvey, she said in February of this year, West Hartford Town Council passed a proposal for an affordable housing IRIS advisory group. Is anyone aware of their work? So I'm not sure if Jen, Kate, or Jack, since you all are residents of town, if you want to share anything about that.
I can mention that I have had the chance to be in touch with the town, and this is a group that's moving ahead and will be doing work, I think, early in the new year, and was excited to see that this event was happening, and there might be some real synergy here around making headway. So that was great.
Nice. And I see Todd said that they formed this over the summer and recently established a meeting schedule. So he shared his contact information for folks who may be interested in participating in those conversations. And so what I will say, and then I'll pass it over to Jen, is that the purpose of these webinars now, they're webinars, but these educational opportunities is to really allow residents of town to, one, learn about the history of their town and their city, but two, to think about the future, to think about the role that they are playing in these systemic issues, and to think about the ways to change these unfortunate discriminatory practices in their town. So participating in these type of discussions and asking questions, attending these discussions, passing it on to your neighbors, and being like Jen and Kate as well, stepping up and saying, I realize this is an issue in West Hartford. What can I do about it? How can we galvanize our network to learn more? Because we want to do better. And also participating in the conversations that Todd put in the chat as well. So thank you for joining us today. I'm going to pass it over to Jen. But before I pass it over to Jen, I would just like, again, to thank Kate and Jen for really taking the time to think about what they wanted to share with the West Hartford community. And so this we had talked about over the summer, and they really stuck to it and stood up and said, I think it's time that we address this issue here in West Hartford. And you heard the data. West Hartford is doing pretty well, but we have to really address the internal segregation within the town of West Hartford. So with that being said, I'm going to pass it over to Jen.
Thanks, Taniqua. I'm Jen, one of the West Hartford Town Ambassadors. I want to thank all of the participants for joining us tonight, and a special thank you to our presenters, Jack Doherty and Tanika Hughley. And thank you to Open Communities Alliance for hosting the event. I think some of the interesting things that were brought up by Taniqua, were the facts in the background on the housing segregation in Connecticut and West Hartford, and how where you live impacts health, education, and access to opportunities. Not something that I would have really thought of before starting to work more closely with Open Communities Alliance. And the part of Jack's talk on the history of housing segregation, how did we get here with policies like the federal government involvement, lending rules, exclusionary zoning. He provided us with a really great overview of how things got to be how they are today. So if you're interested in being involved in Open Communities Alliance work, you can join the coalition. It's on the OCA website, which is ctoca.org. Or if you're interested in being a West Hartford Town Ambassador, you can contact OCA, information also on the website. Thanks for joining us.
Awesome, thank you. And Erin just put the link in the chat, and I'll put my email address in there as well. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. The recording and all materials will be shared with all registrants. Thank you.